When talking about medieval kings, we normally mention events associated with their reigns, as sometimes those events can define a king's life or end it, and even shape their legacy. Remembering these events can shape our perspective of the various medieval English kings, especially if the said king caused the event. Some events are more famous than others, so in this video, we will explore each medieval king of England and which events are the most famously associated with their reign. I must stress that some events may not be as famous or as obvious as others, and depending on your own interpretation of these events, you may agree or disagree on their significance. But this is my own interpretation of these events, with the focus being on economic, social, military, etc. You should all know the order by now, King Alfred to Henry VIII, as this is the 4th episode. Alfred the Great. It's quite hard to pick one single event from Alfred's reign, as there's quite a few to choose from. I think the most obvious to many people were the Viking attacks and settlements known as the Danelaw during Alfred's reign. To quote one of our sources, the inception of the programs of military, cultural, and civil reforms, which in combination expressed the distinctive character of his achievement. The biggest event militarily for Alfred was his victory over the Vikings at the Battle of Edington. Alfred and his army had fought a lot of battles, both on land and sea, against the Vikings, but the Battle of Edington is the most famous. Both the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles and Asser mention the battle, but they don't give numbers. Asser does mention each side fighting in the shield wall formation. The victory enabled Alfred to enforce whatever demands he wanted in order to secure a lasting peace. One event from Alfred's victory was the baptism of the Viking leader, Guthrum. One economic and social event was the building of the burhs, fortified towns and cities built to protect from raids. Alfred expanded and created quite a few new burhs. As someone from a burh, the city of Worcester, the construction of burhs is a major event, as these towns and cities would become major commercial hubs in the later Middle Ages and beyond. Edward the Elder. Incredibly similar events happened during the reign of King Edward. Various battles of the Vikings, further expansion of the burhs. There was a comet that appeared according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Thankfully, no stability was lost. For military events, one battle that is mentioned is the Battle of Tettenhall, where Edward's army and an army from Mercia joined forces to attack a Viking raiding army. This Anglo-Saxon army caught the Viking, quote, and they got in front of the raiding army from behind when it was on its way home. The Chronicles further mention that the Viking army fled, with many being killed. The other major event from Edward's reign is him taking control of some land from Mercia when Ethelred, Lord of the Mercians, died in 911. The Chronicles mention London town and Oxford. Then in 918, when Edward's sister, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, died. Depending on which version you're reading within the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, either Edward took direct control of the Kingdom of Mercia through submission, or briefly, Ethelfled's daughter took control before Edward displaced her. This ties into the issue with Edward the Elder's reign, which is the lack of information, as charters which might have told us what happened during the later part of his reign don't exist anymore. Aethelstan. The most obvious event for Aethelstan's reign is the formation of the Kingdom of the English. Alfred and Edward were known as kings of the Anglo-Saxons, or Rex Anglorum. After Aethelstan conquered the Viking kingdom of York, what became England was formed, although the exact borders compared to the modern borders of England today is different. As for battles, there is one of the most famous to occur in Anglo-Saxon England, the Battle of Brunanburh in 937. The short context of the lead up to this battle is the hegemony that Aethelstan achieved was challenged by a coalition, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles dub the nation of Scots and seamen foul doomed. Aethelstan had previously raided the kingdom of Alba. The battle is recorded in a rather long poem. The fighting was similar to Edington, where both sides fought in a shield wall. The victory cemented Ethelstan's legacy as one of the greatest Anglo-Saxon kings. The only downside to the longevity of the victory was that Ethelstan would be dead 2 years after the battle, and with his death, the Northumbrians elected a Viking called Olaf to be king. It would be up to Ethelstan's successors to regain the lost territories. Edmund. While his reign was short, a few events occurred during his reign. The arrival of a new Viking army, which took over most of northern England, even reaching Mercia's capital, Tamworth. The subsequent treaty set back England to the size of Alfred's Wessex, but Edmund bounced back, as by 945 England was united again. Edmund even ravaged the obscure kingdom of Strathclyde and then gave it to the King of Scots. But the most famous event of Edmund's reign was his death. He was murdered at Pucklechurch. We've covered this event in episode 2, the death of the kings. Edred, another king whose major event of his reign was having to deal with a Norse king of York called Eric Bloodaxe. The Northumbrians would eventually drive Eric out and proclaim Edred as their king. But for Edred's reign, his illness was the most persistent event, where he could barely eat his food. As for religious events, Edred's reign saw the rising of St. Dunstan, the later Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Benedictine reform, which we will explore when we get to a later king. Edwig. We've covered already one major event for Edred's reign in the previous episode, the raunchy affair. Some other events were that Edred didn't rule England for long, and certainly not all of it. He drove Dunstan out into exile and removed many councillors from his court. The situation deteriorated so much that England was split in two, with Edwig's detractors rallying for his younger brother, Edgar. According to William of Malmesbury, when stripped of most part of his kingdom, and under the shock of this loss, he died. Edgar, one of the most powerful Anglo-Saxon kings of England. This introduction from Edgar, King of the English, New Interpretations, gives us a taste of some of the major events from his reign. He presided over a period of major social and economic change. Early in his rule, the growth of monastic power and wealth involved redistribution of much of the country's assets, while the end of his reign saw the creation of England's first national coinage, with firm fiscal control from the centre. When I mentioned earlier about the Benedictine reforms, Edgar is the king who is the most well-known supporter of these changes. To quickly explain the Benedictine reforms, they were changes in how monasteries operated, with some being refounded, and all monasteries and nunneries being centralised to follow the same customs. Under the direction of the Regularis Concordia, these changes were issued by King Edgar and implemented by reforming churchmen such as Ethelwald of Winchester and Oswald of Worcester. As for any Viking armies during Edgar's reign, none appeared or were recorded. The final major event of Edgar's reign is his coronation at Bath in 973, which the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles record in a praise poem. Bath made a change from the normal location where Anglo-Saxon kings were crowned, at Kingston upon Thames. The coronation can be interpreted as a culmination of everything the monastic reformers wanted, or at least that's what's implied from the poem, making it a strong piece of propaganda for the reformers. The coronation also took similar parallels to those in Europe, specifically from the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne, so a grand affair. Yet, less than 2 years later, Edgar would be dead, and some rather dark events were now on the horizon. Edward the Martyr. It's pretty obvious the most famous event from Edward the Martyr's reign, which is his murder. Again, we've covered it, but I can mention some other events in the short time frame of Edward's reign. The star comet appeared, there was a great famine, and some of the ealdormen started taking back some of the land given to the monasteries. Ethelred. I believe the most famous event from Ethelred's reign is the St. Brice's Day massacre, or the Battle of Molden. We'll start with the battle, And to preface this, during Ethelred's reign, Norse attacks and raids started to ramp up again to an incredibly destructive scale early in Ethelred's reign. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles tell us that, 980, in the same year, Southampton was ravaged by a raiding ship army, and most of the town dwellers killed or taken prisoner. And the same year, the land of Thanet was raided, and in the same year, Cheshire was raided by a northern raiding ship army. These attacks would continue throughout the next decade, with the Battle of Molden becoming one of the most famous episodes of this period, as it was recorded in a poem, but we're not sure on the date of the poem. The battle is mentioned and named in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, as well as in the Lives of St. Oswald. The battle was fought as previous one, shield wall versus shield wall. The Anglo-Saxons were led by an ealdorman called Brynolf, who urged his warriors on until they were overcome and killed. This defeat caused a change of policy. Instead of fighting and chasing the Norse attackers as Alfred and his subsequent successors had done, they instead chose to pay them off, as Ethelred was advised to do. The policy even went as far as to pay some Viking fleets into Ethelred's service, but this again failed, as Ethelred's government had to again pay them off, and according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, then, in the middle of this, ordered all the Danish men who were among the English race to be killed on Bryce's Day. The interpretation from the Chronicle is not what it seems. To quote the historian Marc Morris, the far likelier and more realistic assumption is that Ethelred had decided to do away with the remaining members of the mercenary force that had been in his employ since 994, those Vikings who had not deserted and were still billeted in various burghs. These actions would lead to Ethelred losing his throne. Sven Forkbeard. What can we say about a king who conquered England but was never crowned and died 5 weeks after the conquest? Talk about a fork in the road. Edmund Ironsides, another short reign characterized by a constant amount of battles with Sven's heir, Cnut, the most famous being the Battle of Asandun in 1016, and similar to our previous ones, the finer details are lacking. Our sources are mainly the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which only mentions a great betrayal by an ealdorman named Edric fighting on Edmund's side, giving Cnut and his army the victory. Later chroniclers, such as William of Malmesbury and John of Worcester, just lament the losses on the English side, as any attempt of the numbers of combatants is folly, although we can argue that each side probably fought similar to Eddington and Malden, shield wall versus shield wall. Cnut. There's quite a bit we can talk about with Cnut's reign. The North Sea Empire, which I feel needs a new name. While the conquest of England for Cnut is impressive and a major event, I want to focus on a few other events which I deem just as important. One is the division of England into 4 parts. Quote, Cnut divided the country into 4 in 1017, keeping Wessex for himself and giving East Anglia to Thorkel, Mercia to Edric, and Northumbria to Eric. Neither the precise purpose nor the duration of this move are clear, but it was probably largely intended to provide an interim military government, facilitate the collection of taxation, give Cnut's chief supporters the impression that their efforts were proving worthwhile, and hold the country down. This was a different step, and it had to be as England was conquered. Instead of a new Anglo-Saxon king getting the support of, say, Mercia or Wessex, this was a new regime, and as the Chronicles mentioned so much death from the numerous battles prior, many parts of England were up for grabs. The other major event I want to mention is Cnut's visit to Rome. Rome is an incredibly important place to visit for many people, but the journey was dangerous and expensive, especially for visitors from Britain and Ireland. Plus, the time away could be up to a year. No king of England before Cnut had visited Rome. Only King Alfred, king of the Anglo-Saxons, had gone as a boy. In fact, more Welsh kings had visited Rome over English ones in the early Middle Ages, so Cnut travelling to Rome was a significant event, and is a testament to the power and prestige Cnut had developed over the course of his reign. Cnut wrote a rather long letter to be delivered to his men in government, stating his reasons for the journey to Rome, which features the normal stuff for a medieval king: redemption of sins, salvation for the people under his rule, etc., and some political agendas. Harold Harefoot, he ruled for nearly 3 years, so a short reign. However, there's one major event, that of the death of Alfred, Ethelred's son. After Cnut's conquest of England, Ethelred's 2 sons by Emma of Normandy, Alfred and Edward, were exiled to Normandy. By 1036, both men tried to return to England. One reason was a letter from their mother, Emma, which may have been dubious. Alfred and his retinue were intercepted by Earl Godwin. Alfred was later blinded and left to die at Ely Town. Hathur Cano, while his reign ended with a loud thud, he is most well known, especially in my area, for sacking the city of Worcester, as Hathur Cano demanded according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, and then started a very severe tax that was endured with difficulty. The Chronicles then mention Worcester. Here Hathur Cano had all Worcestershire raided on account of his 2 housecarls who were collecting the formidable tax when that people killed them within the market town inside the minster. Other chroniclers such as William of Malmesbury and John of Worcester add more details, but they're writing about the sacking much later. Edward the Confessor. A major problem with Edward's reign, I think, is that it is overshadowed by what happened afterwards, with the climactic battles of Stamford Bridge and Hastings, culminating with the Norman conquest of England. But ignoring all of that for Edward's reign, there's quite a few big moments of his reign. One is the construction of Westminster Abbey, the most famous abbey in England. Early in Edward's reign, in 1044, there was a great famine, with the price of corn and wheat rising greatly. Later in his reign, there's the exile and return of Earl Godwin, the father of Harold Godwin's son. But I would like to focus on something that is rarely paired with Edward, a warrior spirit, as I would argue Edward in the public consciousness is just seen as the saintly Edward, who was one of the last kings before the Norman conquest. But Edward ruled England for over 20 years, so I'm going to talk about a few examples of Edward showcasing this warrior spirit. The first being the expected invasion of England by King Magnus of Norway. Edward would not be like his father and try to pay off any Norse incursions into England, so Edward gathered his army and his navy and waited its sandwich. The invasion thankfully never came to fruition. Edward was even forceful to his own mother, Emma of Normandy, at the start of his reign by taking back from her parts of the treasury she had taken. Harold Godwin's son. The most famous event from Harold's reign should be obvious. We could choose the Battle of Stamford Bridge or the Battle of Hastings, as they are both interpreted as an end to an age. William the Conqueror. There's so many major events we can talk about with William's reign. The conquest, building of castles all over England, the harrying, outlawing slavery, the Domesday Book, all major events. Instead, I'm going to talk about a personal tale which is related to something incredibly important to me, the preservation of heritage and the teaching of it. So alongside building castles, the Normans also started to remodel and replace a lot of Anglo-Saxon churches and abbeys. And this year, 2024, I visited Canterbury for the first time. Canterbury is a special place for English history, as it's where St. Augustine started to convert the Anglo-Saxons from paganism to Christianity. And one of the sites there is St. Augustine's Abbey, which is maintained by English Heritage. The abbey was one site the Normans heavily remodelled, and when you go to St. Augustine's Abbey, English Heritage offer audio guides, which are a brilliant aid as you're exploring it. And when you get to the location where St. Augustine's tomb was, the audio guide plays a small drama which explains the reasons the Normans changed St. Augustine's Abbey. The actors portraying the Normans gave them this arrogant, posh English accent, which I thought was hilarious. It went something like this. We had to change these abbeys as they were so primitive and unrefined compared to our glorious Norman churches. Of course, we had to get special dispensation from the Pope to move the holy relics of St. Augustine. I thought it was a brilliant way of presenting English history in such a silly way. William Rufus. The main issue with William's reign is that his death is the most famous moment of his reign. Again, we've covered this in a previous episode. Henry I. Like his father, William I, there's a lot of famous events from Henry's reign. The conquest of Normandy, legal reforms, Battle of Titchenbray, Battle of Brumoul, all important events, but there's one event that just makes all of these irrelevant, as the event I'm about to mention nearly ended Henry's dynasty, the White Ship disaster. Henry had achieved a great victory over the French king at the Battle of Brumoul in Normandy. In 1120, Henry and many nobles who came with him sailed back to England. However, one ship known as the White Ship had aboard many young nobles, including Henry's heir, William. Numerous chroniclers record this event. The short story is pretty much everyone on board became drunk as hell. The boat then crashed into some rocks and sank rapidly. Only 1 or 2 men survived, but King Henry's heir, William, drowned. His body was never recovered, and Henry never produced another male heir, which would lead to civil war, which our next king is best known for causing. King Stephen, the anarchy. King Stephen is synonymous with the civil war he started by taking the throne of England. King Henry, for years after his male heir's death, had made his nobles swear repeatedly to support his daughter, the Empress Matilda, to the throne. However, this didn't happen, and Stephen, with a little help from his friends, managed to convince the Archbishop of Canterbury to crown him king in 1135, and a few years later, the Civil War kicked off, lasting from 1138 to 1153, with King Stephen coming to an agreement to adopt Henry Plantagenet, son of Empress Matilda, as his son and heir. Henry II. There is so much drama with Henry's reign, a near-epic conclusion of the anarchy where both sides nearly clashed in a huge battle, marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, the French king's former wife, the Angevin Empire, the Norman invasion into Ireland, the Great Revolt, in which Henry's troublesome sons and Eleanor tried to curb Henry's power. But the biggest event, in my opinion, is the murder/martyrdom of Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Thomas was an incredibly effective administrator, so he gained service and eventual friendship with Henry. When the position of Archbishop of Canterbury became vacant, Thomas was one of Henry's nominations, although according to one source, Thomas did warn Henry about his selection. I knew that you would demand many things, for already you presume much in ecclesiastical matters, which I bear unmoved. To summarize this quarrel, it was mainly down to issues relating to the king and Thomas's opinion on ecclesiastical matters. After many years of back and forth arguing, Henry, in one of his many red-faced angry rants, which he was known for, where we get the phrase, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" Like I mentioned, he would subject himself and anyone around him to an angry rant. One source mentions Henry saying, "What miserable drones and traitors have I nourished and promoted in my household, who let their lord be treated with such shameful contempt by a low-born clerk?" 4 knights heard the king's cries and promptly went to Canterbury and later killed Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral. The murder shocked everyone. Henry had to do some serious penance to make up for it, not only for his soul, but also having to spend a huge amount from his coin purse. Richard the Lionheart. The Third Crusade is one major event Richard partook in, although the illness Richard suffered from sounded horrible. There's also Richard's imprisonment, which cost England, essentially, the cost of another crusade. As for Richard's biggest event, it's the Three Lions, or the heraldry symbol for England. Richard is considered the first king of England to use the symbol, and it's during his reign we really start to see heraldry in use, as it's a fixture of a representation of the High Middle Ages and onward. John. There's quite a few events for John. The sealing of the Magna Carta, the loss of the Angevin Empire, the murder of his nephew, Arthur, Duke of Brittany, the First Barons' War. But for John's reign, I want to focus on the economic side just after the start of his reign in 1199. In 1200, the rapid rise of prices, inflation. It's hard to explain the rise of inflation at that point in time. There's no singular cause, although there is a suggestion that inflation shot up during the early part of King John's reign from payments in silver. England's economy in the Middle Ages was nearly all agricultural based, and wool was a huge export, as England is ideal for rearing sheep. It wasn't just England suffering from price rises, it was happening all over Europe from 1180 till 1220. The problem was for John, these high prices meant war was even more expensive. Knight fees increased massively, and knights were the chaps you need if you're going to war, especially over the seas into France, as well as rent prices. The heroic, brave, and much needed landlords had to raise their prices as well, or change the way they ran their estates. This no doubt added or inflated John's reputation as a grubby money grabber, although kin killer is worse. Henry III, the remodelling of Westminster Abbey, the provisions of Oxford, which eventually led to the Second Barons' War. And I'm picking the bloodiest battle in England since Hastings in 1066, the Battle of Evesham in 1265. The background to the battle was Henry had kept trying to maintain and expand royal power and authority ever since he came of age. This led to dissatisfaction amongst his barons, along with Henry's failure to keep within the agreements in the Magna Carta. And one of his barons, Simon de Montfort, who was also Henry's right-hand man. Simon became the leading figure in the Barons' War, and he had already defeated Henry and his son and heir Edward at the Battle of Lewes. But now the tables had turned on Simon, and he was trapped at Evesham by an army led by Prince Edward. Simon still had in his company the king as a virtual prisoner. The rules of chivalry didn't apply at the Battle of Evesham. Rather than capturing an enemy and ransoming them, most of the nobles with Simon were killed in the battle. The Evesham Chronicle mentions that Simon was. He was prostrated alone on the ground, with his hands and feet severed and his head cut off. Henry himself was nearly killed in the battle, and thousands others died. Edward I and the Conquest of Wales. Mainly because the conquest had such a lasting impact on Wales. Ever since the Norman conquest of England in 1066, the Normans began to chip away at the Welsh kingdoms, as Wales during the Middle Ages was a collective of kingdoms, sometimes united, but always their own distinctive kingdom. The Norman ventures into Wales can still be seen today. One example are the many castles in Wales, and one of the first the Normans constructed was Chepstow Castle, right on the border of England and Wales. As for Edward's conquest, it began in 1277, by which Edward had subjugated the Welsh princes, reducing their power and territories, plus getting submissions from them. The problem was, the Welsh were being treated like shit. This caused tensions, which boiled over on the 21st of March, 1282, when a Welsh force stormed and sacked Hawarden Castle. Despite some initial victories by the Welsh, Edward brought the full power of English military might and organisation to bear on Wales. The conquest was brutal, with thousands dead, and the subjugation was manifested by Edward's prized castle at Carnarvon. Edward II, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, a period where, due to such a vast amount of heavy rain and cooler temperatures, caused many different crops to fail, grains such as wheat, rye, peas, oat, barley, etc. It also didn't help that the Scots had been sacking the north of England for the last few years due to a lengthy war. Edward wasn't a great king. He did try to alleviate the problems facing his people, but they didn't work. Starvation would kill many people, with some tales mentioning cannibalism. Those that survived this dark period and into the early 1340s might then suffer from a horrific plague. Edward III, the start of the 116 Years' War, which is a huge event which Edward did start, but it's got to be the Black Death, as the social and economic damage inflicted was on an unprecedented scale. The Black Death was caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. How the bacteria spreads is interesting, but also terrifying. Fleas on rats was one way of transmission, but also on humans, such as the ones in our body hair, called body lice. The plague came into England around 1348. England's population at the time was around 4 to 5 million people. In the first outbreak, over 1 million people died. Interestingly, it caused a massive loss of clergy members as they were highly at risk due to giving mass and performing last rites. The Black Death is a hugely popular subject for many areas of study in the science community. One paper argued that the bacteria, Yersinia pestis, suddenly diverged in the later Middle Ages, shortly before the Black Death, into 4 new branches a polytomy geneticists have called the Big Bang. Richard II and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. While boy King Richard didn't cause this event, he certainly ended it. Living in England in the 1300s is just awful. The Great Famine, the Black Death, the 116 Years' War with France, and the fact that your king is a 14-year-old boy. The background to the Peasants' Revolt is complex, ranging from issues with social and economic freedoms, access to justice, misgovernment, wages, prices, taxation, etc. One tax that was incredibly unpopular, called the poll tax, which was a tax every adult had to pay. This version of the poll tax can be credited to John of Gaunt, one of Edward III's many sons. The revolt kicked off when villagers around Brentford in the county of Essex refused to pay. This caused a chain reaction along southeast England. One of the leaders of the uprising was called Wat Tyler, and there's many jokes that can be made from his name, but Wat Tyler ended up being killed in an open meeting with young Richard. This is when we get to the most famous moment of this tumultuous event. Seeing one of their leaders killed, the disgruntled people were about to unleash their fury when Richard charged forward and is alleged to have shouted, "You shall have no captain but me." This calmed the situation down and was thus the beginning of the end of the Peasants' Revolt. In the next few months, the main leaders were executed and Richard enforced back control. In one instance telling a man, "Villeins you are, and villeins you shall remain." What a villain Richard was. Henry IV and the Welsh War of Independence under Owen Glendower. Wales had been conquered by Edward I, and English laws implemented over Welsh ones. This created a legal framework for discrimination against the Welsh. This was one of the major reasons for Owen's decision to start the Welsh War for Independence. Ironically, Owen was a highly educated man in English laws, and he declared in a letter to the King of Scots that he would free from the oppression and captivity they had suffered since the time of Cadwallader. Owen's fight for an independent Wales lasted from 1400 till his death sometime in 1416, which lasted over Henry IV's reign. Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt. Henry had kick-started the final part of the 116 Years' War with France, and the Battle of Agincourt is considered one of the most famous battles of the war. But the battle can be described as the world's biggest mud fight, due to the fact that the mud was so thick and dense the heavily armoured French knights got bogged down and stuck, whereas the majority of Henry's army was mostly English and Welsh longbowmen. To see a modern-day visual representation, watch the Mud Wizard versus the German police video. Henry VI and Edward IV, the War of the Roses. The big old family fight. While most of the causes of the war can be placed at Henry's feet due to his poor kingship and his mental health problems, which worsened over the course of the war, there were a few issues in the background that facilitated the war. The fact that Richard II had been forced to abdicate set a precedent for the removal of a king, and that Edward III had created the powerful position of Duke. But the major reason is simply that Henry VI was inept at being king, whereas Edward IV fitted with the style of medieval kingship for the time. It also helped he looked the part, being much taller and stronger than most other men of the time, and also weirdly lucky. The weather seemed to aid Edward in some of his major battles. One example, at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross, 3 suns appeared, which was seen as a divine sign for Edward. The final battle between Edward and Henry for the throne would be at Tewkesbury. Although Henry was nowhere near the battle, his son and heir, also called Edward, was. The battle was a complete victory for Edward IV. Henry's son was killed shortly after the battle, and Henry would be later murdered. Edward V, the Princes in the Tower. I really don't like talking about this event, as it makes me sad. The disappearance and or murder of Edward IV's 2 boys, Edward and Richard. Their disappearance is firmly blamed on our next king. Richard III and Henry VII. The end of the War of the Roses at the Battle of Bosworth Field. Another double event for both kings. Richard took the throne due to Edward IV's 2 boys being declared illegitimate. Richard wasn't a popular king, and Henry's cause was being promoted by his mother, Margaret Beaufort, who was married to Lord Stanley, the powerful 1st Earl of Derby. By the 22nd of August 1485, Henry and Richard's armies met at Bosworth Field. During the battle, Richard spotted Henry and his retinue. Richard then took a gamble and charged towards Henry. We can't say for sure how close Richard was to fighting Henry, as the sources give varying accounts, but Lord Stanley soon charged his troops on Henry's side. Richard was cut down, but knowing the wounds he suffered during the battle, Richard put up a bloody good fight. But Henry was the victor, and so ended the Plantagenet dynasty's rule over England. Now it was the time of the Tudors. Henry VIII. There's so much we can talk about with Henry's reign. The Reformation, the divine right of kings, the Tudor conquest of Ireland, the creation of the Royal Navy. But you can probably guess what I'm going to talk about. The dissolution of the monasteries, where many monasteries and nunneries were torn down and sold off for a fat stack of cash, which Henry used to pay for a war with France. So many sites were torn down, and you've seen some of what's left of them during the course of this video. It's a huge event that changed the physical landscape of England massively, which had not been seen since the Norman Conquest.